And the updated link is up on Twitter, and we've also shared it in the chat window. So let's begin. Good evening, everyone. My name is Harsh Bedi. I'm the founder of Mandate Project. So first of all, I'd like to thank everyone for taking out time and joining us this Saturday evening. Also for enduring a little extra screen time on your weekend. We're going to do our best to make it worth your while. The conversation ahead will discuss something of critical significance for the near and far future of our society. The role of artificial intelligence in economic development, technological innovation, security, etc., through its varied applications is undeniable. At the same time, so are the risks posed by harmful systemic and social implications if the same is not properly regulated. It is often pointed out that ethical considerations must be integrated into AI design. But is that enough? In the coming hour and a half, we intend to discuss what some of the considerations are and how they can be enforced to ensure that AI develops for the common good. Before we dive in, there are a few announcements we would like to make. Please note that our session today is being recorded and shared on a live YouTube stream. Before I speak a little bit about Mandate Project, I'd like to invite our partners from Civis to give you an introduction of the organization and also to give you a little walkthrough on how their platform works. So with that, I hand it over to Divya. Divya?
Sure. Thanks, Harsh, for that introduction and for helping facilitate this discussion. Good evening to all of you. Thank you for attending. So before I get into the work that Civis does, I'll give you a little introduction on what this entire discussion entails us to do. My name is Divya and I'm a product manager at Civis. So close to 6 years ago, around in 2014, the government of India had come out with something called as the pre-legislative consultation policy. It's called the PLCP, that essentially mandates that every draft law and policy has to be first put out for citizen feedback before it is formalized. This is so that the entire lawmaking process is made very collaborative and democratic. So essentially, it gives you the right and the opportunity to share your views and suggestions on policies that impact you. This kind of nuanced feedback that comes directly from the citizens is very helpful for the government while forming a well-rounded policy. Facilitating this process is what Civis does. So one can access the website of Civis, read these consultation policies in a very simple summarized format, which is in English as well as Hindi, and share your feedback at a click of a button. This feedback is thereafter directly shared with the respective government department and or the ministry. So it gives you an easy channel for corresponding with your government while making the consultation process very constructive. We are constantly working towards ensuring that the feedback can be effectively utilized by the government. And your responses in this regard will add a lot of value. To explain this a little better, what I shall do is let me just share my screen and take you through this consultation itself, which essentially talks about responsible AI for all, and just demonstrate how one can share a feedback. I will just be sharing my screen. So what we are seeing here is the website of Civis, on which the consultation, which speaks about the working document enforcement mechanisms for responsible AI for all, which has been published by the NITI Aayog, is shown on the website. What one can do is read the summary over here. This basically encapsulates what the consultation is saying in a short summarized format. One can also access the detailed document by clicking on this link. Once you go through the summary, what you have to do is submit your response by clicking on this button. I will be doing it myself right now. It requires me to sign in or sign up. Once I have signed in, I click on the submit response button. I have my response already drafted over here. I have to select a satisfaction rating, which basically tells the government what is your sentiment with respect to this consultation. At this point, let me introduce to you what other citizens are saying. So on the website, you also have a choice to browse through what all different citizens have to say about this consultation. This is what a lot of citizen leaders on our website have been saying. One can go through this. And if any of these feedback points resonate with you, what you could do is also click on something called as use this response. This essentially will take the same content and you can use the same response under your name. So I have drafted my response over here. This is what you can see. And after this, you just click on submit the response, which essentially will make your response displayed on the website. One also has the option of sharing any of the consultation link on any of the social media platforms and within your circle. We only have 6 days left. The last date for submitting the response to the government is the 15th of Jan. So I would really urge you all to visit this, read what the document has to say, and I'm sure our discussion today will help understand this a lot better, and thereafter submit your response. So I hope this was helpful, and I'm sure towards the end we'll be sharing the link with you also for easy access, and hope to now listen to some interesting points that come up on this discussion as well.
Thanks a lot for that, Divya. Yes, we'll share the link at the end of the discussion. And just a few words about Mandate Project as well. So Mandate Project aims to create a space to involve people from all walks of life, experts, practitioners, academics, industry leaders, the government, and very importantly, also laypersons, to come together and find solutions to the problems that our society is facing today. We see the need to bring common sense, lived experience, and the will of the people into the policy discourse by recognizing their importance and by amplifying the voices of all stakeholders. Complex issues will never be solved through isolated efforts, but through open, inclusive, and truly collaborative endeavors, of which today's discussion is also one such reflection. Quickly, a few housekeeping rules before we start. I know virtual calls have become an unavoidable evil, and I'm sure we have a lot of Zoom call veterans with us. Nevertheless, I'd quickly go over some rules before we begin. Firstly, all participants will be kept on mute while they're not speaking. Panelists, however, will be able to unmute themselves. All participants are requested to keep their videos off during the discussion. Please use the chat box to share any comments and questions during the discussion. Mr. Apar Gupta, Dr. Sarayu Natarajan, Ms. Aparna Ashok, Mr. Rohin Garg. Thank you all for joining us today for this discussion. We have a diverse and accomplished panel of speakers with us. We're deeply grateful for your participation and look forward to diving into the discussion. By way of brief introductions, let's start with Mr. Apar Gupta. Apar is a lawyer and the executive director of the Internet Freedom Foundation. Prior to becoming the executive director of IFF, Apar practiced law for more than a decade in law firms, and his work as a lawyer included key digital rights cases on privacy and censorship. He was included in the Forbes India 30 Under 30 list in 2014. He has worked extensively with activists to set up digital campaigns, such as those on net neutrality, which is SaveTheInternet.in, the fight against defamation laws, SpeechBill.in, and Safeguard Privacy, SaveOurPrivacy.in. Apar is committed to advancing values of the Constitution of India in a digital technology-mediated society. Next, we have Dr. Sarayu Natarajan. She is the founder of Aapti Institute and has a background in management consulting, venture investing in financial services, program development and management, and academic research. She holds a PhD in political science from King's College London, a master's in public policy from the School of International and Public Affairs at Columbia University, and an arts and law degree from the National Law School of India University, Bangalore. In her spare time, she co-hosts the Gantantra podcast. Then we have Ms. Aparna Ashok. She is an AI ethics researcher, technology anthropologist, and service designer. Aparna specializes in ethical technology development of automated decision-making systems. She consults, advises, and trains automated system creators and owners on operationalizing AI ethics. She is a member of the advisory group of Wellcome Trust's Data Lab and was named on the 100 Brilliant Women in AI Ethics list for 2020. She is the founder of Ethics Sprint, a participatory workshop sensitizing technology creators to the human impacts of technology and prototyping products to be more humanity-centric. She is also the co-founder of Rudderly, a career support platform for Indian millennials. And finally, we have Rohin Garg, who is an associate policy counsel at the Internet Freedom Foundation. He has a bachelor's degree in mathematics from Cornell University. Before working at Internet Freedom Foundation, Rohin worked as an associate analyst at PRS Legislative Research. So if it's all right with the speakers, in terms of the sequence, we can start with Dr. Natarajan, and then we can take Rohin, Apar, and Aparna. Or if you guys would like to change the order, we can do that however you prefer. Is that all right? So Dr. Natarajan, if it's all right, we'll begin with your opening remarks.
Right, I would have loved to go later, but I guess it's okay.
If you'd like to go later, we can do that.
No, it's fine. It might seem a little bit context-free if what I think Apar and Rohin are speaking about is not said. So if you want to do that, that's okay. Otherwise, I'm happy to go.
Rohin, would you like to open in that case?
Sure, I can take the lead.
You can reverse the order and go that way.
Sure.
The floor is all yours.
So can I start? Sure. So hi guys, I'm Rohin. Perhaps some amount of very quick context setting. Obviously, as has been pointed out, Niti Aayog has released these two documents for us to pore over and get back to them with consultations. And the second one actually is perhaps the one at least we focus on more, which deals with the enforcement of mechanisms for responsible AI. And I think I'll just discuss without going too much into depth I can go into them later. Just very quickly, some very precise concerns, or not even concerns, some themes that emerge. So one thing that the document carries on from basis of what was written in the first document is that it lays down these certain principles, such as transparency, privacy, and what have you, as the core of regulating AI in India. And this is not uncommon. Several jurisdictions, several companies, and several organizations have put out AI ethics frameworks as something to be mindful of and something to sort of serve as a guiding light for both AI ethics researchers and AI and people who actually implement the AI. And this is of course very good. But the issue, I think, that in the Indian context that arises is that, for example, when the document mentions that there exists adequate amount of legislatory framework as it is, that may not be entirely correct. Now, so if you have a situation where you don't have a data protection legislation, which is something which is in the book, which should soon come to the table. It's being discussed by Joint Parliamentary Committee right now. But when you don't have that and you just have principles, then enforcement of these principles in whatever way, whether true to the opinion of the original framers of said principles, may not always happen correctly. And so, even without going into anything else, AI principles are good, but you need to spell them out. So something as common as privacy and transparency and accountability, of course, are necessary. But what would they actually mean? Do they imply certain technical standards? Do they imply a certain sort of decision-making process? Do they imply certain barriers as to what cannot be used? There's also another important reason. For example, if I just look at two principles, the protection and reinforcement of positive human values and privacy and security. Now, what happens? I mean, you can easily imagine a case where the two sort of contradict each other, right? I mean, in cases of security, what happens then? And so, to ensure that there is some sort of common method of acting that adheres to what the framers of this policy and indeed the citizens of India would like to see from such a policy, it is important to go beyond mere I don't want to say buzzwords, but to really detail what these mean. Secondly, this ties into the prescribed regulatory method. So what the policy says is that there's going to be this Council on Ethics and Technology, which is going to be, in the words of the document, a highly participatory advisory body. Now, again, so its functions include doing research, representing India, managing and specifying certain guidelines. But again, the issue with such a body is that, again, in the absence of a data protection legislation, what happens when something goes wrong? What happens when you have a company that doesn't really adhere to these guidelines? Forget adhere. I mean, given that as of now we just have simple principles, what happens? These principles are unclear. It may even stymie, for example, innovation, where investors and then private companies or even governmental bodies may be uncertain about investing and going ahead with certain plans because of this regulatory uncertainty. So to not just specify that, but ensure there's someone to look into that. It would seem that there would be a need for some sort of stronger regulatory oversight body. In fact, this document draws upon what a lot of other countries have done. And while it is true that initially many countries have been advocating for a light touch regulatory model with this oversight sort of council, there is a sort of change in the air now. For example, I believe last year there was this UK government report which itself said that, okay, we now have to start moving away from a mere advisory body to a more oversight based mechanism. And that's because as we go more and more digital, certainly last year has exacerbated that entire push towards digitalization. The potential harms increase exponentially. And so then I think that brings us to another key theme, which is how to regulate enterprises that deal with this. So, for example, the document itself says, okay, for example, in public sector enterprises, you'll have a sort of procurement council, an ethics committee, which will look at, okay, for this purpose, we're procuring this AI. What are the risks inherent in this, and then sort of figure that out. For the private sector, it's adopted. Basically, existing leadership would have to assume certain ethics roles, and while one can indeed understand why that's been done, the rationale for that is not clear. I mean, or not perhaps enough to necessitate such a light touch model. When you have industry leaders like Sundar Pichai, CEO Alphabet or Google, saying that just if nothing else, just because as we move forward, no single company is going to be able to adequately deal with the regulatory and issues that will come up, and so some amount of government help to ensure that this technology that has wondrous benefits really helps the citizens of the world. In our case, in India, that help is necessary. There have been significant AI failures, and I mean, whether catastrophic or not, and there have been instances of companies themselves course correcting. But for example, IBM with when they had Watson for cancer care, they found that this wonderful AI that they developed, when they at least had these pilot programs, it was found that it was giving extremely erroneous sort of advice that, if not for the foresight of doctors, could have led to severely deleterious health outcomes. Let's put it that way. So there is a need to introduce some sort of oversight. Now, when we talk about what sort of oversight this would be, we have one particular example in the Data Protection Authority proposed by the Personal Data Protection Bill 2019. And that authority or something like authority, there are other examples out there as well, could then serve as the lighthouse to and of course as a security guard of sorts, but to ensure that these companies can deal with these regulatory challenges without causing too much harm. Because of course, when given the how new this field is, there will be issues, there will be complications, but to ensure firstly that these issues don't become catastrophic and that there is some sort of safeguards or some barriers in place to protect users and citizens, some sort of need for a proper regulatory body does emerge. And I think this could best be done by, for example, even the Council of Ethics and Technology in its current form, as laid down by the document. It certainly has the power to conduct this sector-wide comparison and sort of examination of what are various threats. So there are of course general threats such as overfitting and biases and exclusion, and of course privacy creep. But what are the sector specific threats? And so then assessing these threats and assigning some sort of threat vector to each sector could then help policymakers decide, okay, maybe we don't need a blanket sort of, you know, this strong regulatory mechanism. Maybe we can go sector by sector and ensure that, okay, where it's needed, if a certain sector doesn't need to be as heavily regulated, then we can allow a more light touch model. So having some sort of this sort of study would really help. And for example, we in our own comments to the ministry, we actually conducted a mock examination based on AI Now's AI accountability toolkit, and it's not something that has to be to raise any concerns of being a luddite or whatever. The everyone appreciates the need for this technology, but at the same time, this technology will I mean, the point of this entire technology is for it to help citizens of India, and to do that, there has to be a somewhat stronger regulatory mechanism than is mentioned in the document, at least my opinion. Thank you.
Thanks a lot for your comments, Rohin. I think that at least it frames quite well what is the specific requirements in terms of the regulations and also the strength of a regulatory body that would be required. So thanks for that. Apar, would you like to go next, or may I propose a slight change in the order? Would that be?
I'll just take 3 minutes.
Okay.
There's one section of the comments which I also inputted in. So rather than taking time separately, I'll just complete it in a block. So the submission that we have made, that's online on our website on internetfreedom.in. As Rohin explained, the core themes are appreciative of the government looking towards artificial intelligence, creation of ethics and norms, but also looking at a regulatory framework, whether that needs to be essentially self-governing or regulatory norms need to be made through a process of legal formulation, which we believe should be the case in certain specific sectors based on what is the sensitivity as indicated by Rohin, which may cause towards specific deployments of artificial intelligence. One such specific deployment is artificial intelligence is in policing and also in welfare services. We have concentrated more towards the use of facial recognition technology and policing, how smart city controls are being done, because AI is sometimes only viewed as a benevolent technology for autonomous cars rather than as policing technology, where it is also being used quite often to categorize people within suspects and potential offenders. Given a rule of law framework in India, which needs to improve further, police reforms which have been categorized as something which is well needed, and also the unique technology risks which emerge from the deployment of facial recognition technologies in policing forces, again, not proceeding from the Puttaswamy judgment, which is the 9-month right to privacy judgment, principally which do not even have any underlying legality attached to it for the procurements which are being done, for the deployments which are being done. And sometimes the technology is being used for a whole range of purposes, not being limited either towards what are initial procurement objectives, such as identifying missing children, but also towards identification of crimes or videography during public protest, do indicate that there's a need for regulation towards preservation of human rights. Our belief is artificial intelligence is a technology which will make our lives better, and a good direction towards it can be through a model in which there may be a requirement for regulation in certain sectors, as well as a greater degree of flexibility in certain other sectors where private industry can innovate with a much more free hand.
Thanks a lot for that. That was very succinctly put. And in terms of the constitutional perspective and rule of law, I would perhaps, once we get to the moderated discussion, have a few questions I was hoping to ask you. So with that, can Aparna, if you're ready, would you like to speak next?
Sure. Yeah. Great. Thank you. So I'm going to start off with just doing a primer around sort of responsible AI and what that really means, and then go on to a few themes under it, right? So what do we really mean when we say responsible AI? It needs to be transparent in objectives and outcomes. It needs to actively consider human rights implications and has to mitigate risks. It needs to be inclusive at all levels. It needs to be responsive to system failures, and it also needs to respect data ownership. And this is, I mean, these are generally held principles. They're not, I'm not coming up with this is not new. This is just a consolidation of what already exists. And the other thing, as we go into this discussion to get on the same page about is, like when we talk about AI, we also need to talk about it from a much more sort of grounded perspective. So I prefer to think of them as automated decision-making systems, which essentially make decisions that have perhaps previously been taken by human agents. And these are distinct from computer programs in the fact that they are decisions made on various variables. So they're not a simple lookup function or a clear, like if this, then that. It has a few different variables, and that's how these decisions are made. And this might be obvious, but I just want to restate it so that we were all really on the same page. I'm going to go into some of the important themes to keep in mind as we talk about responsible AI, and and also maybe like bust some myths while we're at it. So the first thing I want to really talk about here is bias. So one big myth is that somehow when we take human beings out of the equation and place a machine to make those decisions, is that just purely the act of taking people out of the equation somehow makes it unbiased. And there couldn't be a bigger myth than that, because these decisions are still programmed in. The decision logic is made by individuals, is made by existing systems, and hence the system is implementing certain individuals' worldviews at scale. Make no mistake, that's exactly what is happening. And I mean, of course, we've seen implications of it in studies abroad, and we keep seeing some in India as well. So I guess to the people who are interested in participating in creating ethical systems or even automated decision systems, remember that the organizations and the people making it are consciously and unconsciously imposing your will on a large group of people, and that and that is what is really happening. So let's be clear about that. The second theme in here is one of scale, right? By definition, again, automated decision-making systems are implemented at scale. That's what makes it profitable. That's the whole business case for it, that we build it once and it essentially rolls out and is able to do it at scale. Now, in the product world, we have a saying that when you build for everyone, you end up building for no one. And, and of course, then we sort of risk doing that a little bit when we build AI systems as well, where you make it for a few people, quite likely. So what's important here is to identify the personas that represent various critical groups and then design for them. And then human beings, we have a tendency to impose or project our views onto certain groups of people. So that affects the personas that you build if you aren't really taking the effort to understand that from these people directly, right? Instead of paraphrasing them, instead of putting down what you think they are thinking or what they need, you do need to paraphrase it or wherever possible, quote it in their words. And also the other thing that we do as human beings is also, the groups that we know are comfortable with, perhaps relate to more, we put more details into it. And that's another way in which we end up designing more towards people who we know, or designing things for ourselves rather than designing it for the actual people who these systems are intended to. Especially when you think of top-down systems, right? Like public services, where it's not an opt-in, it's where everyone has to use that now in order to avail certain services. It's not something where they have an alternative. This is particularly important, which then brings us to the next theme of inclusion. So, and this conversations happen quite a lot, I would say, within the Indian tech design sort of environments, where inside teams you hear things like, we are the experts, we know best. Again, myth, right? No, you don't. If you are not the person who you're designing for, if you're designing for somebody who lives in a rural area, you can make an educated guess at the best, but they know their reality more than you do. And this mindset is changing, but again, if you are part of creating these systems, if you're part of that decision-making process anywhere, please keep that in mind. So especially in a country like ours, with so much diversity of language, culture, education, digital literacy, etc., building AI solutions are also a feat in diversity. That's going to be a big challenge, but also the biggest opportunity, right, for market differentiation, but also to make a difference. So as creators, you do have to understand sort of, again, real needs and nuances of the people who you're building it for. And this diversity of the people who will be using what you're building should be seen in your research, how much ever possible within your team, because that is where, again, micro decision making is happening, and definitely in your advisory panel. And that advisory panel needs to represent people who are reflective of all your stakeholders, including the people who are using it and the people who are affected by whatever product you're putting out. So, and this is where, when you talk about how your team needs to be sort of structured, you also need to be using interdisciplinary or a transdisciplinary team, wherever possible, people who already are familiar with two different domains that might not intuitively fit together. And this is because, say, for example, if you take a social scientist and a computer scientist, very different ways of working. Social scientists, very thorough, probably would take the time to do things right, and data scientists, very broad strokes, so don't hold me on this, but data scientists might be about getting the output, getting it based on accuracy, right? So there might be creative tensions there, but with those creative tensions, along with like a clear common objective, is what will improve your solution. So as much as possible, try to incorporate like researchers, lawyers, engineers, data scientists, social scientists and sector experts, wherever you can. If you can't afford to have them on your team, just make sure you get those inputs, have regular checkpoints. That is in a lot of ways going to make or break your product. Now, what a lot of these essentially boil down to is this theme of power. Because technology is not neutral. It is extremely, extremely powerful. And India is rich in skilled talent, eager to make a difference, right? And so we have plenty of problems that also need solutions at scale. So this is a wonderful opportunity to drive the nation forward. But that said, it's very important to constantly ask yourself this question: if you have if you are in that privileged position of designing for others, designing decision-making systems for others, you need to ask yourself, why are you doing the work that you're doing, right? And maybe you want to give rural areas a level playing field. Maybe you want to make education accessible. All of that is great, but you need to ask yourself that every day, because good intentions are just not enough. The way the human impacts of tech work out, you'll all use. There's a little bit of a time gap. There's a little, it happens in different worlds. You sit and create it in a certain world, it plays out in a different world, and then how it impacts other lives happens somewhere else. And you're not going to see it just because you have a good you're well intentioned. You will have to actively go find that yourself, because it's, again, like a hammer might be a tool, to go back to the tech is not neutral thing. A hammer might be a tool, but AI is not a static tool. It is a complex and contextual system, and has a very active impact on people's everyday lives. So if you are involved in creating automated decision-making system, ask yourself every day if the impacts you are aiming for are being met. Who is it not being met for? Where is it failing? How can you build an open and responsive feedback? This is particularly important because we don't see this being talked about enough. System failures are inevitable. It will happen, but when you're creating it, you need to be accounting for it. You need to allow people to tell you that the sooner the information gets to you, the sooner you can fix it, right? So how do you build an open and responsive feedback loop from where the system's failing? And also, what unforeseen risks are this creating? You do need to very actively question this, because this is not an easy information to find. Most people don't want to hear this information, but it is a reality. So what power does this give to people? And what power does this take away from people? Again, not intuitive questions, but keep asking yourself that. And hold your organization responsible for this as well. It might not be a conversation that your team or your organization is interested in having, but you are in there. If you're part of the system, ask them that question. And why? Just so that way you can avoid having an Oppenheimer moment, right? Robert Oppenheimer is the father of like the atomic bomb, and it's famously said that when he saw the mushroom cloud, he started questioning his own actions, and famously quoted, "No, now I'm death myself." So don't wait for 3 years when you can see these risks balloon into catastrophic events. You can see it now. The way I've heard it articulated before is that ethical risks don't come up like an iceberg, right? It's as if your product is Titanic the boat, then it's as if there are small holes built in it over time, and at some point it becomes big. So don't wait for that big event. Keep looking for it actively. And we've also, maybe 5 or 10 years ago, you could say, well, I couldn't have seen that, but now there's no more excuse. There's enough information out there. We've seen lots of consequences, so they're not they might be unintended, but they're not unforeseeable. So I think part of your responsibility, if you are creating this, you have the power, or you are in such a powerful position by creating this, which means it is your responsibility to start looking for what could happen. So whenever you see presentations that says, oh, this is how we're changing X industry, or this is how we're improving people's life, or here's the market value that we're creating, ask what are some of the unintentional ways in which this could harm people. And this is not just an intellectual exercise. So ask how us falling short will affect people, and then go and fix it. That needs to be incorporated into your next product cycle. So if you have any ambition to be in this field, in being in, building automated systems, remember that it's your every small action as you're building it does affect people in very concrete ways. And as a nation, we do tend to be quite enamored by AI because it allows us to leapfrog. It helps us build solutions at scale. And one way this presents is that how good an AI system is often measured internally, at least in terms of its accuracy. So, and that's really just not doing enough. That only tells you if it's good within your controlled lab environment. And when it moves into society, it needs to do a lot more than that. So I will just reinstate my summary of, a responsible AI essentially is transparent in objectives, outcomes, actively considers human rights implications and mitigates risks. is inclusive at all levels, is responsive to system failures, respects data ownership. And this is the definition of a well-functioning automated decision-making system. And anything short of this, you're actually being irresponsible. So let's responsible AI is just enough to make sense of it, but really that's actually what is the definition of a well-functioning system. Thanks.
Thanks a lot for that, Aparna. I think that's a very insightful overview of what responsible AI and AI ethics entails. And I think it also ties in well to what Apar was speaking about earlier in terms of the perceived benevolence of AI. And it's not something that you can assume at face value, right? There is a tendency of mission creep in terms of what an AI sets out to do, or any technology or any solution sets out to do, and what it eventually may end up doing as an unintended extension of what it does. So I think it's great. And it's also, you spoke about power that sort of gets created by these tools, right? AI does engender certain kinds of power to those who utilize it, those who are working with the data, and it also reflects the bias or the biases that may be inherent and overlooked by those who are designing the program. So all of these things are essential, and they must be kept in mind when any technological solution is being developed. So I think that's a very insightful and very helpful overview, and we'll come back and problematize some of those points in a bit. So Dr. Natarajan, if you're ready, we'd love to hear from you next.
Right. Thank you very much. It's a very hard act to follow anybody who quotes Oppenheimer, but I'll try my best. But one of the things I like to be able to do in this conversation is to take a little bit of a step back from the Niti Aayog note on the oversight body and talk a little bit about the question of responsibility itself. Because it's a fairly complicated word. I do think some of this will probably make its way to our comments as well, but more broadly, what does complicate the idea of what responsibility and what risk mean? It's very interesting that a lot of the conversations around responsibility in AI, a little bit here, but this is obviously a very complicated conversation. But a lot of the complex conversations around AI, and I think a couple of the others also alluded to it, is the idea that AI is A, fundamentally benevolent, and B, that responsibility can come from within the AI itself. I would argue that that's central, but I also think it's very important to consider sort of the human frontiers or the human architecture that sits around AI in order to be able to tackle the question of responsibility in AI. So there's sort of three components, or three, I guess, actors or stakeholders that one needs to pay attention to in sort of thinking about this human frontier and the sense of responsibility in the context of AI. So there's, of course, society and individuals who are typically in very many of these conversations seen as recipients of the impacts of AI. Then there is markets or the organizations, businesses that are developing AI, startups, big companies, a range of people. And sometimes the state itself, I'm looking at the state as a sort of separate bucket, which you could see primarily from the role of it being a regulator, not necessarily a developer of AI. Of course, there's a whole debate about whether what are the limits of the entrepreneurial state in a certain way, but we'll not go into that for now. The idea of, I want to, just sort of going back to reiterate the point around why it is important to not think of AI alone as in itself having the agency to think about responsibility. I think, Aparna alluded to it in talking about politics and talking about the way in which certain sort of viewpoints or agendas get encoded into the technology. I'd highly recommend, I'm going to take my role as an academic seriously, I'm going to highly recommend reading Langdon Winner's landmark piece on Do Artifacts Have Politics? And I think that's really the heart of it. But it is the argument in that piece, but also more broadly that humans encode these biases. And therefore, we need to have this conversation about who is responsible and to what extent are they responsible. Now, of course, civil society and society more broadly is often made responsible for a whole lot of change that is expected to be wrought in the context of technology more broadly, and definitely in the context of AI. Just as an allusion, like, the conversation around WhatsApp's not new privacy policy, but WhatsApp's privacy policy. And suddenly everybody seems to have woken up. And it seems like there's a social movement or an exodus out of WhatsApp into other platforms. But what you're actually thinking about or sort of evading is in this conversation is the need to make and hold technology companies accountable. So while civil society or citizenry or consumers or end users can play a role in voicing out what their experiences are, or even making claims in a certain way, a culture of responsibilism in the context of responsible AI is probably problematic. You can't make citizens responsible for violations or problems with the way in which AI or any technology has an effect on their lives. So that's the first argument. And I think also, if you think about within citizen groups themselves, there are huge differences in power. There are difficulties in being able to access means of claim making. And in that sense, the oversight body does something interesting, which is to think about civil society representation in different components. But having said that, what that means for the responsibility of civil society to claim for responsible AI is something we need to really unpack and talk about a lot more. The second dimension, of course, is markets. And I think, I don't have as much of the nuance that Aparna does, but I do think there are two components to think about in the context of responsible AI from the market perspective. There's, of course, the implication or the harms that AI is likely to wreak on a population, right? So there's, violations of privacy or like data protection more broadly, non-discriminatory effects or discriminatory effects that algorithms could have, and also potentially the lack of accountability or the lack of grievance redressal mechanisms in a certain way. There's also another component to pay attention to, especially in the context of markets and the role that they play in responsibility for AI, and that's the production process itself. One thing I must say before sort of talking about this more, I am not of the view that AI is useless or is not helpful. I think it has enormous potential to improve human lives. And I think it also has enormous potential to bring in populations that are hitherto not represented into various domains and in various ways. But having said that, I think we need to complicate this idea of responsibility, particularly the role of markets in this context, right? So I feel like, thinking about not just the harms that AI causes, but also the production processes. And Aparna alluded to it, the ways in which data is used, the ways in which data is labeled to produce or train algorithms. There's a whole supply chain, there's a whole workforce that labels data for algorithms to learn. So, I will obviously give a very basic example, but if you think of a driverless car that needs to be able to recognize objects on the road, you have a whole force that is labeling pictures from the road as this is a tree, this is a lamppost, and this is a car, or a range of things like that. And there is this workforce that needs to be considered, and their production of AI. So the idea of responsibility cannot end or cannot be limited to the implications on end users, but needs to also consider the process or the supply chain or the way in which AI is made. So that is sort of the heart, in a certain way, question of responsibility in the context of market or market actors. And I think, this is a point to talk about this question of self-regulation. I know the oversight body that the Niti Aayog document does or sort of frame this as frame the need for self-regulation and not being very heavy-handed with regulation in these early stages. And the constant sort of trade-off that is presented is this idea of innovation. I'm not skeptical of the idea that we might not want to regulate before we know the implications, but that is not necessarily to take away that should not be used to take away from the possibility or take away from the reality that market entities or market actors are not necessarily incentivized to solve for certain or problems. They're not necessarily incentivized to solve for value chains. It most often is an act of corporate citizenship, responsible capitalism. So those are the discourses that frame more ethical actions by market actors than necessarily business bottom line questions. I mean, of course, this is not to take away from the idea that, more ethical businesses are more likely, I guess, to have, more robust bottom line. But this is the heart of the conflict. So if you think about what is a company most oriented towards solving, it is to solve for the bottom line. And sometimes very many of these questions around responsibility could get traded off. And so I think being aware that thinking of responsible AI or putting it solely within the realm of market-based actors to be able to do this is something we need to think about a little bit more. Then, of course, is the state itself. Now, I said I will not talk about the state as developers of AI, and I think Apar and Rohin talked about it a little bit, particularly in the context of, this state using AI technology, such as in the context of surveillance. It could also be used in other ways, I would imagine, sort of detection of leakages. There's sort of some applications you could imagine in the context of what the state does. But having said that, I think the big role and the question here to think about is the consequences to citizens. And I think, I really can't add much more to what Apar said, which is the idea that what the state does and the scope of intervention in a certain way must come from frames of rules of law, as well as a consideration of the implications on citizens or people within in the context of as in it should bear in mind the constitutional frames that we are subject to in some ways. Again, the idea that the state action has to account for the liberties, the rights and rights of citizens, while also paying attention to encouraging innovation. The question we need to talk about, and I have a view, but the question that we need to talk about is how is this line to be navigated, considering the potential of AI in certain domains. So that is the consideration for the state. So if you think about what civil society does, what markets do, and what state does, being aware of not just their capabilities, but also the incentives that operate in the context of each of these entities is very, very critical. The other question, of course, and this is a little bit of a parallel question, is this question of risk. And I did talk about it a little bit in talking about market actors, but it's almost always designed or assessed or evaluated in the context of implications, like it has a discriminatory impact or it has an exclusionary impact. It tends to create more complications that it solves. So it's always through a consumer or an end user or a citizen lens. And I think definitely in the context of thinking about risk, the risk that this means for the value chain and those that are sort of creating the data, both as sort of users of consumer products, which then generate the data that can feed into AI, as well as the conscious process by which labelers are engaged to work on data. Are both sort of things that need to be paid attention to very strongly. Just sort of to highlight, I guess, one aspect of labeling work, like content moderation work could be seen, for example, as feeding into, compilers and algorithms that, regulate or sort of determine what you're seeing on your feed. There's a whole lot of humans that are doing this work, and there's a whole lot of literature emerging on this around how dramatic it is, how difficult it is. The huge attrition rates, the psychological effects, both in the short term and in the longer term. And we know very little about this, but this also has to feed into any understanding of risk, because the idea that risk is only the implications of AI is not necessarily true. Because if there is AI that in its essence requires very many humans to face terrible consequences, then we need to sort of start talking about what does responsibility even mean in that context. So paying attention to the supply chain of workers, the ethical use of data, and in some ways, in a subsidiary way, the effects on competition are all things to think about in risk over and above sort of the implications of it on end users and customers. So I'll pause here and hope to pick up on some of these threads in the course of the discussion coming up as well.
Thanks a lot for that, Dr. Natarajan. Yeah, that helped frame, responsibility in terms of like who the actors are, what frames ethical action, and I think it gives us a great starting point. So before I pose any questions and we get into the moderated discussion, I'd just like to ask the panelists, in case anyone would like to either follow up on what the others spoke, or if they would like to pose any questions to each other or respond to anything, before we dive into a few of the questions that I'd like to pose to you. Anyone, if you want, please just feel free to unmute yourselves and go right ahead. So I see smiles and silence. I take it that that's a cue to move on to the questions. All right, so I just want to try and also like locate this discussion on artificial intelligence, on responsibility in terms of the legal framework. And I'm going to lean on the lawyers who we have on the panel also, in case they would like to add a little bit of context to this for the benefit of just not just the audience, but for the rest of us as well. So, for instance, Apar spoke about the rule of law, and we also know that any conception of responsible AI must fulfill constitutional responsibilities, incorporated through workable principles. Now, when we speak about this constitutional framework, how would you locate this? What are the existing precedents, either in terms of the regulations that are there, laws, the case law, etc. How would you situate this discussion?
Is this supposed to me?
Sure.
Okay, so good way to go about it is just to look at the 2017 9-judge bench right to privacy judgment. Para 70 of Sanjay Kishan calls opinion lists 4 basic criteria. There needs to be a law. So what does a law do? A law provides purpose, legislative sanction, not only legal authority, but also a sense of boundary. It's like, think about, visualize it, physical picket fence, what can be done. And the minute you step outside that picket fence, you end up in a zone of hazard rather than just being in an unregulated space by itself. Or it can make a conscious choice that we are not placing picket fences in certain places. Now, dumping this metaphor, what are the other ingredients listed in para 70? It needs to clearly identify what's the purpose besides the for the rulemaking, okay, which is the legal authority, the act of legislature, and then necessity and proportionality. In a sense, if artificial intelligence is being provided a degree of legal recognition, state support, which can also be there, right? It shouldn't only be, we should view AI as a threat vector. AI is an opportunity, again, and I am a person who believes in technology, in the benefit of AI. We are already using it in our lives. But what does scare us is not only the Terminator 2 Judgment Day, but what really does scare us is exclusion. How is it visits in harms towards people who don't even have smartphones, but are usually data subjects in entitlement schemes, where essentially their biometric scans are being matched with an algorithm that is a form of AI. Hence, is the legal recognition and the purpose proportional to the intended purpose by itself? And if it's not fitting in well, if it's not necessary, if the personal data is being gathered, then there are clear boundaries which are being breached. And as Sarayu put it, as Aparna put it so well, there needs to be safeguards. Of course, this legal regulation will be further defined through conversations amongst academics, technologists, AI ethicists, specific across certain verticals, which is why I think the document by the Niti Aayog is excellent. I think both in process and form, the constitutional framework does very well by encouraging public participation and a sense of deliberative democracy. The mandate of fulfilled by Civis, as well as the mandate project, encouraging this kind of conversation. Secondly, this kind of deliberation can then input and then enrich a outcome which can be premised on the right to privacy judgment, because the right to privacy judgment is actually articulation. If you look at the summary towards the end, all the 9 judges agree. It links to each one of the fundamental rights which are under Part 3 of the Constitution of India. Okay, so I do think there's a degree of complexity in application which will vary. There will be a need for an oversight body. It can have memberships from a diverse background, but will need a very heavy representation of independent experts, independent in the true sense, to ensure that it can be beneficial without leading to any kind of rent seeking or capture by any group specifically.
Thanks a lot for that. I think it was also good to hear that our fears about Terminator Judgment Day and are balanced out by the fact that there are a lot of checks and balances to ensure that we don't reach a. But I'm going to use that as a segue into a related question on protection. So since you talked about exclusion, I mean, you have exclusion that may happen either by design, or you may have unintended exclusion in terms of how, say, the technology operates. And you also spoke about the collection of data of citizens. So with that in mind, on the issue of data collection and also of data monopoly, how do you think the interests of citizens can be protected? What do you think are the current gaps with respect to such protection, and how can a regulatory body here address those? Again, this is open. If in case anybody else also wants to weigh in, do feel free.
So very quickly, I think on premises, the first thing is that when you look at data collection and data nationalism, that we don't have enough data, another country has enough data, it presumes data as a resource and as a property. And it's reflective of my own personal bias. I do believe markets play a very important governing role, but I don't think so they need to be the primary governing force beyond certain frameworks. It's an acknowledgement and recognition of a social condition of fiscal and economic interest playing a part in any kind of domain. But data is not primarily an economic resource. It's actually a human resource. And also burgeoning data collection violates one of the core principles of data protection, which is data minimization. So on principles, first principles itself, amassing large amounts of personal data is, according to me, problematic when it's acontextual and without purpose. The second related corollary to it is also a much more technical one. I think this is something Aparna may and Dr. Natarajan may actually be much more technically proficient in filling in. So I've read Nick Bostrom's Super Intelligence as well as Life 3.0, and they describe the evolution of AI, which has happened through essentially discovery of logical paths and patterns by amassing large amounts of personal data, even depersonal data, which can't be tied to individuals, by discovering logical paths, what happens when A behavior happens, B and C conditionality, just like a loop, right? If A happens, B, if C happens, E, F, G. Okay, so that's how it happens. And this is a very complex chart which data actually enriches. But what you have as the modern form of AI are what are called as deep neural networks, where you actually don't need excessive data collection, and we are actually breaching that barrier, where the model itself is so intelligent that it self-discovers, self-teaches itself. All it needs is play. Rather than discovery. So it needs actual field operation. So here incrementalism and actually using it in applications which don't cause social injury is much more important rather than excessive data collection. Data monopolies need to be broken also through data minimization technologies, but not only through that, through data portability. Silicon Valley has a huge stranglehold, and I don't think so a competitive environment, if the government has more data or nationalizes or expropriates data and then reallocates is a long-term solution which portends something very positive for human rights.
Thanks a lot for that. Aparna, would you or Dr. Natarajan like to weigh in as well?
Yeah, I want to chime in because data monopolies in itself, from any angle, is highly dangerous, right? For a couple of points. One, that is a huge database of information that you're storing in one place that makes it highly susceptible to cybersecurity. And no system in the world is 100% safe, especially with quantum computing coming in. There's nothing that you can promise to keep safe. So there is a very strong argument for decentralized ways of data ownership and also data storage. So yeah, so keeping all of that data in one place, just by default, setting up for a huge risk of just a cyber attack. The other is, there's a lot of unstructured data that sits in servers. Of course, the environmental impact of it. Two, the data in itself doesn't mean as much. So like Apar said, at some point, if you just press play, sure, like there can be lots of inferences that the system can make itself. Now that is again dependent on what kinds of data you are storing in there. Yeah, store religion, caste, store sensitive data with less sensitive data. It's going to make its own inferences, and there's nothing to say that they're actually meaningful, or they could be extremely hurtful, and they could be extremely inaccurate as well, because when data takes decisions, especially without oversight, it is what it's really good at is predicting based on past behavior, right? And one good example, I think one meme, in fact, that really speaks very well to this is of all the vice presidents of the United States, right? I don't know how many of you saw it right around the time when Kamala Harris got elected. So it said essentially if an algorithm was to predict this would have never happened. So human beings are very resilient. We are very good at being creative. We are very good at breaking molds, and the world is changing in such dynamic ways. And so an automated system can make probability predictions. For it to make possibilities or plausibilities, one happens easier than the other, let's put it that way. Whereas if you want to know what all could happen, and and put a number to it, that it can do, but under direction. So within how data and automated decision making system needs to be built and rolled out, like there is a very strong argument for a human machine symbiosis as well. Back to data monopolies, the other big risk is that it is a consolidation of power, right? Sure, like it's not an economic resource, a human resource, but unwillingly held and also reaped benefits from whoever has the ability to store it. Which is again like another power imbalance that is being created because India still does not have a strong privacy law. There is no ability to be forgotten. There's no ability to say, I don't want you to keep my data. I don't want you to make inferences from it because I don't know what you're inferring from it. I don't want you to give me higher health insurance premiums. I don't want you to change prices for me depending on what devices I'm using. These are all, these are invisible to the person, the human being at the end of this equation. So it takes away a lot of those abilities. So yeah, the cases for building data monopolies are purely individualistic, whether it's an organization and the stakeholder power they want. But when you look at collective good, right, even the people who are building those systems and putting those in place should recognize that this is a disservice to themselves. It's actually not helping any of us move forward other than extremely select a handful of entities who are actually profiting from it.
Yeah. Dr. Natarajan, would you also like to weigh in on this?
Not very much to add, thank you.
Okay. So from here, from data monopolies and what is done with our data, also, like I'm glad you pointed out things like the absence of the right to be forgotten and what use the data collected is put to. I think that ties in really well to another question that I had in mind, which is that of trust. Because I think trust is an important thing, and you see depleting reserves of social trust in terms of not just technology, but also in terms of what governments do with the data that they have on their citizens, or also like in terms of how that may be shared with other entities and misused. So with a view to trust, I think even in terms of the submissions that IFF had on this discussion document, you noted how deployment of artificial intelligence leads to a large number of high frequency decisions, which amplify the effect of unfair bias. So maybe if Rohin would like to illustrate how this happens, what and how these kind of this unfair bias, when it gets amplified, what kind of impact it may have on social order and trust.
Yeah, so I think the issue, the first technical issue that comes up here is that as of now, AIs are what are called black boxes, where they have we've achieved supreme levels of accuracy at predicting behavior with good AI models. But we don't know why that happens, and that is still an ongoing field of research. So when you use AI to say process thousands of insurance claims or say thousands of PDS benefit withdrawals, uh, or even say use it as is happening for like predictive things like predictive policing. It's the technology is there because you want to improve scale, right? We've spoken about that, and so that is a good objective. However, what happens with as I believe Aparna pointed out is that when you label this, the act of labeling is an act of social categorization. You are assigning, you're defining a certain social relation. And so, for example, in I believe in Chicago, there's the Chicago police uses this software called Predpol, and what they do is they assign they have like a grid, and on each grid is assigned a certain threat level based on whatever, previous records and whatever. And there is, I mean, America already has a lot of debate about this, so I won't go into that. But the dangers there are very obvious to see. So and it's also, for example, in the example I've taken, it then feeds into it where, okay, so say in the case of predictive policing or surveillance, suppose you go and you say, okay, this area, which may be an area, just for example, where minorities live, you go and say, okay, this area is a hotspot for crime. Police goes there. That may in itself lead to more sort of confrontations, which may not actually be reflective of society, but may cause the model to believe that, okay, we're sure, this is, I mean, see, our model's right. So the need for trust is definitely there. How to go about solving it is I think is firstly admission that look, this is something that we don't know. We know how to do it, and perhaps the difference between, I mean, this is where, I mean, I'm from science background, so just a harmless joke, but it's the difference between science and engineering. Science figures out why something is happening. Engineering is building a solution to fix a problem without really caring about, as an example, about what the underlying dynamics are. And so the as applied mathematics and computer science progresses, I'm sure we will get a good sort of we will know why certain decisions happen, why the AI model takes certain decisions. And so then that's whatever, then if any sort of agency publishes that, great, we have pretty much direct transparency. Until then, first it has to be admission that says, okay, this is what we're doing, and that admission then has to sort of come with some amount of foresight, obviously at the sort of usage level, implementation level, but I believe, as Sarayu said, also at the production level, where you cannot just be blind to say, okay, look, we had this delivery to do by this deadline, here's the software, AI is a black box. Great. And okay, we will make sure, okay, post facto, if we find any errors, that we'll try and correct it then. Because again, to jump back to the policing model, those post facto errors can have actually very grave real life consequences. So I think a combination of the admission of what we don't know, combined with that having concrete material impacts on behavior, agency behavior, governmental behavior, usage behavior, that has to be there in any sort of deployment, whether from a private enterprise or the government.
Thanks for that. Would anybody like to follow up on this?
Yeah, I just had a couple of additional thoughts. That's very well put by Rohin. I mean, I think if you think about trust in AI, thinking about it from the citizen lens or the user lens in a certain way, there's two components to trust, right? Trust in any system, and in that sense also AI, right? There's the cognitive element where you can see or you believe there are certain things that you wish for, and that's the cognitive aspect of trust. And then there's the affective aspect of trust, which is that you believe deep inside that you don't, or you're not going to come to a certain kind of harm, or there's sort of something to believe in a certain technology or in any system. So paying attention to the trust conversation needs to be able to talk to both of them, right? Cognitive trust in a certain way is addressed by the notion of accountability. And again, I'm speaking loosely here because it's more complicated. It depends on the domain. I mean, there's a huge amount of differentiation that you need to pay attention to depending on who is deploying the technology, what kind of technology. I believe, for example, that the state deploying surveillance technology is at a completely different level than a credit algorithm, for example. And so paying attention to what does accountability mean in context is very, very important. And that goes to the idea of cognitive trust. Now, this question of affective trust is really hard. I think Rohin alluded to this question of transparency. I think it could be one component. But I also think as this technology evolves, we need to pay more attention to the ways in which people are engaging and interacting with it. What builds trust? What causes breakdowns of trust? What are sort of responses and reactions to sort of different ways in which to build trust? And again, going back to the fundamental question of responsibility, who's responsible for doing all of this? Because the idea of trust is more complicated than saying, I trust the AI and therefore I will use it to buy a product or a service, versus I trust the AI and I trust that I will be looked at if I'm harmed, which then makes the state in a certain way responsible or accountable here. So I feel like paying attention to some of these different dimensions is very important in these conversations about trust.
Definitely. And I think, again, I'm going to refer to the submissions that IFF made, but you do point out issues about accountability, about liability also in the deployment of AI tech. So if there are any sort of unintended consequences, who is responsible? Is it the developer? Is it the person who's actually using the technology? So it remains a little unclear, I think, on the face of it. And that does need clarification. Also in terms of...
Can I step in for a second?
Yeah, please go ahead.
So just to what, I mean, this is not entirely perhaps builds on what Sarayu says. I think this is a personal view. I just want to put it out there. I think one issue, especially amongst more in the more developmental sides of things, is that this, of course, builds out from this. I think this originates in the market area, but this view of techno solutionism, where technology is thought of as a solution, is I think what engenders this breakdown of trust. If I may adopt a controversial example, and I think so IFF actually wrote about the agri-stack recently, which was is a proposed sort of collection of databases and programs that the government plans to use to help the agricultural sector grow. And I think the issue, as we witnessed recently, is that technology, and this I'm speaking from the developmental point of view, technology is best, and not only is technology best used, but I believe the people in the end benefit from it are best do so when technology is used to implement in an idea, a solution. AI in and of itself is not an idea. It is something that will help us implement things. So again, to come back to the agri stack, if you implement something like this automated database, partially automated database, without solving underlying issues in the field, you will face errors, you will fail voices of protest and whatever. I think this applies to, and so I think that looking at AI as a tool that helps us solve things, rather than the idea that itself is that just okay, deploy it and everything's hunky dory. I think that is some place at least that goes some way to bridging this trust deficit. Sorry for interrupting.
Oh, thank you. Thanks for that intervention.
Could I add to that?
Yeah, please.
I'm really glad you brought that up, Rohin, because I mean, trust is one issue, but I do think that in India we are very excited about using technology to come up with solutions, right? So techno-solutionism is actually a problem, because yes, technology can be used. Yes, you can use AI to solve problems, but the question is that the best technology to use? Sometimes all you need is low tech. You don't need AI. There are a lot of costs, there's a lot of effort in building it, there's a lot of nuance that goes into building something good, which might not even be needed. So I think part of what, like, as technologists or as civil society members or as the government, right, we need to think about, yes, we want to be the AI garage of the world. That's great, but doesn't mean the solution to every problem is AI. There are lower tech problems that are easier to maintain, that are easier to implement, that are easier for people to trust and understand and practice in a day-to-day basis. That would do as well. So to all the aspiring technologists, all the current technologists, just always ask yourself, is AI the actual solution that is really needed in this situation? If you don't know the answer, go ask somebody, find it, because that's what makes you a good technologist, right? Use it where it's relevant, not everywhere, because that's what you know how to do. Everyone's efforts is best placed in context that actually ask for it. So I'll just put that in there, because this enthusiasm for AI is bubbling forth, and that's great. That energy is great. So if you want to be a better technologist, go educate yourself about where it's best used, how you can know where it's not functioning. But it needs to be said.
Definitely. So we're starting to run out of time now. So I'm going to try to just sum up all the comments and everything that has been discussed so far. And I think putting AI in the right perspective, like Aparna also suggests, is important. And I'm going to pick little bits of what everybody has said. So AI, essentially, at the end of it, is a tool. And there are people in charge of developing these like AI-based solutions for whatever problem it is. This tool can be used for good, and it can also be used for more malicious purposes. For instance, I mean, popular imagination is captured by the idea of deep fakes and other misuses of the technology. So I'm sorry, it's you excuse me just a moment. So it's important to keep in mind that the tool you need to see who's developing and using the tool. What are the frameworks within responsible action can happen for this tool? You simply having an advisory body that does not have any teeth may not be sufficient. You probably need to equip it with teeth, but before you do that, you also need to define the parameters. Like Apar said earlier, you need to identify what the picket fence is, what operates within and without. And rather than me now summing up whatever may be left, I'd request the panelists, if they have any closing remarks and recommendations as we move to closing, for what an oversight body should look like, or any other considerations that seem to be left out by the working document, or things that came up during this conversation that you feel need to be worked on further. So in no particular order, whoever would like to go first.
Very quickly, in 30 seconds, I think technology is something which really excites me. I use it every day and I use it very deeply. I believe in technology, and which is why I also believe that it can result in tremendous harm. And when I sometimes do talk to people who are much more in the product development space, I really enjoy those conversations. And they always tell me, Apar, we need to dream, we need to explore, we need a certain amount of space to make mistakes. And I always say them, say to them, yes, but please do it in an environment where the injury is not visited on others. And we are more than I'll be much more comfortable with that, with their dream and exploration in that sense. And a lot of technologists are taking that feedback more and more. And I believe that that hoorah and that enthusiasm around AI is also being much more reflective of critical thinking now, especially from within the technology community. And it's great that the Niti Aayog has put out this document for public consultation. It is taking and inviting these comments. And I would like to thank the co-panelists, Mandate Project, Civis Project, Aapti Institute for really being supportive of this kind of work and bringing this lens towards something which can really benefit lives of so many people.
Thank you so much for that. Yeah.
Sorry, I'm happy to go next if that works.
Please. Yes.
No, to echo all that I've heard, it's been a great learning experience. So for sure, I feel like I'm going to take back more than I was able to give. But having said that, I mean, just to add to what Apar said, I share his enthusiasm for technology like him. I'm very into it. But having said that, I also have a belief that the long arc of the way in which we do business and work is bending towards companies being more responsible. So I do think that we are at the cusp of a moment here, but I feel like the big takeaway in the context of this oversight body, but also more broadly in thinking about responsible AI, is thinking about the roles different institutions will play, different actors will play, their incentives and how they are changing. Because being responsible is definitely very much a part of the agenda and the conversation, and how that is sort of enacted to be better, not just bring better technology to people, but also to bring more rights preserving, more free technology is really where I'd like to I'd like to spend a lot more time thinking about. And thank you very much. This has been a fantastic discussion and an absolute pleasure to be here. Oops.
Thank you.
I can go next. So, okay, in terms of, again, thanks for getting us all on here to have this sort of spirited discussion. And for regarding recommendations for the oversight body, and I will send you more in text format. But I think if I have to sort of, my sort of high level inputs that also echoes what they've suggested in the document is that it needs to be a very independent body, cannot be nominated. I think people on there need to be selected by merit. And that is a consistent feedback for also the data protection independent authority that needs to come in place, right? So very much like that. It needs to be highly collaborative, whether with other sectoral regulators or with other stakeholders. And I'm primarily talking about stakeholders who have the lesser amount of power in that entire equation. Because it is a game of power dynamics, there's no question about that. So it needs to be collaborative, it needs to be participatory. So the kind of work that Mandate and Civis is doing is incredible. And part of what this oversight body needs to be doing is also take inputs from the ground up, right? If something is starting to serve your community, that's what that's what it would be. That's who you need to hear. The other bit that Apar and Dr. Natarajan, I think all of you spoke about it. One thing I want to echo as well is the oversight body needs to really keep a close eye on application of technology in a different setting. So technologies are sometimes made for a particular context and it's taken and applied in a different context, much like the facial recognition system being used to surveil and to identify protesters, right? So this is something, this you see in the free market world as well, where, I'm going to build this because this solves cancer, but it's really going to be used for other commercial purposes. This is just the party line. And I think we've reached a point where we can see past these things. So similarly, I think the oversight body needs to hold organizations and bodies accountable for what is the stated purpose of their of their technology, right? And the minute you are applying it in a different context, there is another level of assessment or audit that needs to be done. So, I mean, that's going to a whole different area, but I think that's another thing that the oversight body needs to do, which is not mentioned anywhere as far as I can see. Yeah, so that's sort of my overall comments. Anymore, I will send it to you in writing. Thanks.
Thanks, Aparna. Rohin?
Yeah. So I'll get to my final recommendations. I've already, I think, gone through IFF's broad recommendations. I'll just perhaps recap at the end. But to perhaps explain my motivations first, at the risk of being somewhat of a dissenting opinion, I don't think companies and certainly private actors are moving towards incorporating such standards. And I think instances of AI failures, obviously one part of the field is also growing, but I think are increasing. And more importantly, I would think that this is a stupendously important piece of type of technology that we have to use to so improve living standards, especially in developing countries like ours. But at the same time, and I think ultimately for this to happen, you have to make the users' technologies responsible to democratically elected government. Now, I mean, checks and balances and whatever issues in, for example, our countryside, I don't think private actors would necessarily do that, because in abstract, they're like, as I believe Sarayu you can mention, their aims don't prima facie link up with developmental concerns or necessarily even improving lives. So I think so for that reason, there has to be more regulatory oversight. Now, even for example, even in cases of technology, if you could take the example of India, right, where our economy otherwise is a very large MSME sector. Now, if a somewhat similar situation were to arise in AI, right, where you have these larger companies and then smaller companies, larger companies through public pressure could still be made to adhere to certain principles, and more importantly, may have the economic resources to incorporate, say, better anonymization procedures, whereas up and coming sort of companies and sort of enterprises may not be able to do so if you keep it at the level of say, okay, just vague principles. They may not have the expertise to interpret them correctly. They may not even necessarily have the financial resources. So the financial incentive in that package aside, at the level of digital policy, what then has to come is a very strong set of guidelines that provides that uniform playing field, and while also, like I said, allowing the citizens of India to be the beneficiaries of this technology, as I think it should be. Yeah, that's.
Thank you for that, Rohin. So just in closing, I want to say, firstly, of course, extend my deepest gratitude to all the panelists for taking out time and being a part of this discussion. It's been a massive learning experience for me, because the idea was to orient myself as a layperson, posing questions to experts in different fields, and trying to also create, in a sense, a model for what, say, any advisory body should look like, interdisciplinary, bringing in perspectives from very different spaces and with different concerns, but also identifying common issues that we all need to work on. So towards that end, I think we at least got a good start here, and I don't think that this is the end. We, unfortunately, due to paucity of time, couldn't take questions from the participants. But I would like to propose that we move the conversation onto Civis's platform, and I think Divya will be putting the link for the consultation. So she showed you how you can contribute and leave your suggestions, questions, whatever else on the Civis platform. Also, you may access the Mandate Project platform, and you can connect with us over there. But I also want to give a massive shout out to the organizations that have supported us through this and through Internet Freedom Foundation. We use your recommendations and your suggestions to educate ourselves also. And the idea was to then amplify this and bring this into a larger discussion with, like for instance, we got Aparna, who brought a perspective on AI ethics, and Dr. Natarajan on responsibility. And we seek to include even more voices, and we hope to do that through these platforms. So in case, would anybody from Civis like to make any remarks before I formally close?
Thanks, Harsh. I've just shared the link to the consultation in the chat box. Hope to see a lot more responses, and a big thank you to the panelists, because for me, like you mentioned, this was also getting to educate myself. And I think the various nuances which were brought out in this discussion were, it's helped me clear a lot of points which I had in my mind, as well as gain a different perspective to even looking at technology as enabling solutions. So thank you for that. And I hope to see a lot more interesting responses on the site as well.
Thanks a lot, Divya. Most importantly, a big thank you to the Civis and Mandate team who've been working tirelessly behind the scenes to make this event possible. So just I want to put my appreciation on record and say thank you so much for making this happen. I think we've at this stage just about covered everything. So sorry, just a minute. Yeah. Perfect. Thank you very much, and we look forward to carrying on this conversation and hearing from all our participants on the forums. And in case I've left anything out, please do excuse me. I've just tried my best to bring together all the points and make sure that we haven't missed anything important.
Thank you, Yash. Harsh, you've been excellent. Bye-bye, everyone. Have a good evening.
Bye, everyone. This has been a great conversation. Thanks, Harsh and
Thank you,
Civis.
guys.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Take care,
Thank
guys.
you. Have a good evening and a good weekend.
Bye.